First of all, my name is Hong Bo. I am the ex-chair in global finance at SOAS University of London. And I'm also the director for the Center of Global Finance at SOAS. Welcome, everybody. No matter whether this is the first time for you to be here or you are our friends already, but everybody is welcome. So before we start, as usual, we need to talk about the fire alarm thing, but we were not told that there will be a test today. So if there is something, then we need to take those two side doors to leave the room as soon as possible when we hear the alarm. And you know you are going to silence your phone. I do not need to remind you. And so everybody's ready. So of course, online friends, I heard we have a very big number online, and people probably after lunch, they are now trying to switch on and to join us. And thank you very much for the online colleagues, friends. And it is our great pleasure to host this event. And I should thank, I said first time I pronounced the whole name, Professor Dirk Willem Terwelde, who, and the team from ODI, who bring in many distinguished speakers today for us, and including, I heard the acting High Commissioner from the Sri Lanka High Commission will be online. And so, and of course, you will hear from those speakers, they are experts on this topic. And of course, I would say SOAS is probably perhaps the most suitable place to organize this open debate on that problem for developing countries. And you know why. So SOAS has a kind of characteristics, and SOAS is good in this area. And I have learned a lot, actually, in the past months about Sri Lanka before this event. And my interest in my curiosity has been growing, actually. And I like this country. I found it so interesting. And I know you also agree with me. It is a very good holiday destination as well. And today we dig deeper into the 2022 debt default that we heard from Sri Lanka. And we do this not only for the purpose of understanding this specific case, we need to learn lessons from this case. So we want to draw a wider policy implications that we can think about other countries that are in the similar situation. And this is basically a very good lecture of a case study research method. So we basically dig deeper of this case, and then we extend, we generalize to other cases. So of course, the discussion is very, very important given the current situation. So it's very timely in terms of the current situation. We are facing a lot of uncertainties that are surrounding, for example, the walls actually, and geopolitics. Also, as you know, very famous now worldwide trade war, and the fight for the global supply chains. So those challenges, as you can imagine, have put extra pressure on those emerging market and developing economies, as you can imagine, because they are already in difficulties. So therefore, we, as a policymaker, I think our event, our discussion will contribute to the discussion and to provide the insights for policymakers because they are facing the problem how to steer economies to go through those storms and to not only to survive, but also to keep growing. So those are our purpose of doing this event. And of course, I think we should we can learn quite a lot after today's event. And finally, congratulations to the editors, Ganesh and Dirk, and all other contributors to this book. And they already generated the book has already generated a lot of impact even before we do this today. So now I think I would invite Dirk. Are you coming here or you stay?
I can stay here.
Okay, so Dirk is going to have his opening remarks. Do we need a?
Was for Hongbo. Thank you, Professor Hongbo, and thank you so much for hosting this event. And before I start, I should just say also a little bit about the Center for Global Finance that you're leading, and it's providing really valuable services, I must say, over the years. And first Victor Morinda, now you are leading this, because if you think about if about 15 years ago, or now maybe almost 20 years ago, but in the early 2000s, we all thought that we have stable economies. In the UK, at least, we had Gordon Brown thinking about stable economies, and we don't really need to think anymore about macroeconomic crisis, volatility, or financial economics as such. We just need to think about the sort of micro level productivity shifts alone. And that, of course, then the financial crisis came. And then, at least in our area that we were working on, we were just scratching our head to say, well, there aren't that many people that actually are looking at macroeconomic crises. And they all had specialized on agriculture or on other things, and really dealing with crisis in lower middle income countries. There weren't that many people that were really looking at this. Yes, in the 80s there was structural adjustment, and people were looking at structural adjustment and critiquing it in the 90s, also from ODI's perspective. But I think for now the Center for Global Finance has continuously sort of hosted seminars on financial sector, on macroeconomics, and that's really providing a really valuable service to the importance of progress, development progress in lower middle income countries. And so that's been really helpful service that that you're providing. And I'm also very grateful that I'm associated with your center as a professor of practice. Now, what I think I can add, and what this discussion can add, is the sort of the link between finance and the real sector, and really thinking through what does it mean for sort of the debt? What does it mean for to have high debt for growth, and vice versa? Shouldn't we just be growing in order to get out of the debt crisis? And what should that growth look like? And so that link is something that we're all interested in. And today that is an acute problem. Thinking about debt, for example, and private sector debt, but particularly public sector debt, has increased dramatically, almost across the world. And that has been, of course, in the last 5 to 10 years, led to come out of a range of crises, whether it was the COVID crisis, whether it was the Russia-Ukraine war, or some idiosyncratic specific issues that were playing around in a range of countries. So there was a debt crisis, high risk of debt distress, or many countries, like 40 low and middle income countries, that are almost a debt distress or are debt distress, and so financing is a challenge, and the cost of financing is a challenge, and that emerges in a range of countries. So we're talking a lot about Sri Lanka today, but we'll also hear more from Debbie Bhattacharya on Bangladesh, for example, and also Ethiopia, where there are different types of crisis. So in Sri Lanka, debt to GDP is very high. It's one of the highest in the world, and it's a real challenge. And we're going to talk about Sri Lanka. But in other countries, like Bangladesh, for example, even though perhaps debt to GDP isn't that high by official statistics, and Deb will tell us more about what the real number is on that. But if you have very low domestic resource mobilization as a percent of GDP, then even a sort of a low debt can be very tricky as well. And I think that's the case in Bangladesh, because their tax to GDP ratios are very low. And there's a challenge. And in Ethiopia, we also here on Ethiopia, there the challenges are that debt to GDP may not be the highest, but debt to exports is very high. So Ethiopia didn't have that much foreign exchange, and there have been many foreign exchange problems over the years, and also in the last few years. And so there the debt burden was extremely high as a percent of exports. So we're focusing on these crises and then thinking about what you need to do next. And I think there will be three issues that we will be discussing and we want to hear on. So first of all, when you're in a debt crisis, your economy stops working if the crisis is very severe, and you can't operate, you can't import anymore, and that was nearly the case, I think, in Sri Lanka, and Ganesh will talk about that. But what you need to do is you need to stabilize. You need to call your friends. And there will be friends probably around, but there will be some geopolitical friends who can sort of help. There will also be the IMF that you can call in, and together they can then perhaps hopefully bail you out. And then at least you are beginning to get some space, and you can use that. And then you start negotiation. You start negotiations with a range of bondholders, with others to sort of create the financial space in order to keep your economy going. And so that we will be analyzing that a bit. But so Ganesh, you can say a little bit more on the tricky situation that Sri Lanka found itself in. Now then, two other things need to happen. First of all, you want to get yourself in the same problem again, and you need to have these are deep institutional matters. So in the case of Sri Lanka, it has entered its 17th IMF program, and there have been a range of other countries that have had a range of IMF programs because they couldn't get out of the crisis in a way that they could avoid future crises. And so putting in place the building blocks for that it shouldn't happen again is something that is very important in economies. And I think Indereed will probably talk a bit more about the laws that are being put in place in Sri Lanka that are trying to sort of avoid situation of having another huge debt crisis. And then thirdly, and that is the sort of the real challenge for all of our economists is when the stabilization and those issues have happened is what is the future pattern of growth going to look like, and can you engineer a future pattern of growth that first of all avoids crisis in the future, so that you have transformed your economy sufficiently, so you're not vulnerable to crisis like you've been to COVID, like you've been to the Russia-Ukraine war, and other crises, that are able to generate the export revenues, so that you can finance coming out of the crisis through export revenues rather than through deficit financing. That a pattern of growth that is inclusive, so that basically you keep the whole population with you, so you don't get the protests that come with the default, and also a future that is more environmentally sustainable as well. And so I would say sustained growth or sustainable growth starts with having a transformational growth pattern, that you do things differently, you have a productivity shift, you raise your productivity, you go into different sectors, and you also deal with some of the structural policies, and then the inclusion bit will come with that. If you have a broad-based transformed economy, and also if you do things differently, you can also be more environmentally sustainable. So we'll be talking about those issues, I hope, in the case of Sri Lanka first, and then there will be sort of a panel to reflect on this, both in the case of Sri Lanka, but also have two other perspectives from Bangladesh and Ethiopia. I mean, they have similar issues. I mean, Sri Lanka is the smallest economy, like 80 billion or so, and then dollars. Ethiopia is twice the size, and then Bangladesh is, I think, 4 or 5 times the size of Sri Lanka. But I think there are perhaps parallels there that we can draw on to sort of see how do countries deal with crises, this stabilization, this not be getting into the same challenge again, and same problem again, and then probably we're all still trying to feature to understand is how do we have a more transformative growth, and all countries face that problem. I mean, we can't say can't have a seminar without perhaps mentioning Trump with his trade policies, for example. That's exactly what you don't want to see, right? Is that you have another sort of set of trade policies that are putting the global economy backwards rather than forwards, and it's going to be, we'll have to see what kind of impact that's going to have on other countries around the world. But I think we're trying to think about this transformative growth pattern. Economists, macroeconomists are working on this, thinking about what can you tinker, what policies can you change, how can you shift into new sectors, how can you get your labor more productive, and so on. And then somebody stands up and just says, well, 25% tariff, and then a lot of work is undone in terms of the growth effects, and so we need to remain vigilant, not just in lower middle income countries. In all countries, it's going to be a challenge. So I'm very pleased that we will have that discussion, and we'll do it on the basis of a book, and Ganesh will talk more on that. I'm very pleased that we will have that, then a panel discussion, and also some more general remarks on the role of finance in crisis, going from debt to sustainable growth from a colleague Phyllis as well. So I don't know, Hongbo, if you want to go back, but go back to you, but then we go to Ganesh to hear more on the book and laying the foundations. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dirk. So I said the 5 minutes is very short for everyone, but we are a little bit over. But Ganesh, so now I think Ganesh prepared your slides, right? So Ganesh is actually a visiting fellow of ODI from working with Dirk at the moment, but he is supervising the government policymakers in Sri Lanka as well. So Ganesh.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this second edition of the book, which is entitled Sri Lanka from Debt Default to Transformative Growth. And the case of Sri Lanka is particularly interesting because in the literature it was known as a basic needs success story as early as the 1970s for a low-income country. So that was one line of thought that people associated Sri Lanka with. The second bit of it is this debt default that occurs in April 2022, a preemptive default, and this economic crisis, which was the worst in its history. And this was now in a middle-income country, right? So you have these two very interesting aspects of this. And this book tries to give you a sense of what that challenge is and what needs to be done going forward. So the context where we start thinking about the book in more detail is not so much the crisis per se, but thinking about the recovery. And Sri Lanka is quite remarkable also in the literature in the future, as people will see, for having come out of the crisis to this stabilization phase, right? So you go from a scenario where the economy is contracting at 7.3% in 2022, poverty is some 25 to 50% of the population, inflation is at 70% and possibly going to a cycle of hundreds of percent of inflation, and reserves are down to 25 million, a couple of hours of import. So that's what the scenario was around the default. To today, where the economy in 2024 grew at 4%, quite a remarkable recovery if you think. Still, the GDP is lower than what it was in the pre-crisis phase. We're in deflation, so inflation has been squeezed out through very strong monetary policy from the central bank, and the reserves are some $6 billion odd dollars, right? But poverty is stubbornly high. The current administration of President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, the National People's Power, a left-leaning group, deserves credit for keeping the IMF program, but with some tweaks. And that's part of the story. There was also Indian aid. There was very good policy from the domestic side, including the central bank, which raised interest rates and then tried to bring them down afterwards, and also made sure there was financial stability. And the problem today, as we sit on the 2nd of April 2025, is that there are risks to this growth. And Dirk Willem talked about them. The IMF factors this in. When they came in the third review a few weeks ago, they thought about 3% growth in 2025 and 6. And that number might actually be overstating the issue, given the external environment that we now face, which was happening before as we had thought, and is going to come after the forecasts as well. So we have this government that is trying to follow the IMF program with tweaks that now faces a lot of external risks. Another big risk is we have a big outmigration of skilled people in Sri Lanka, and that's a big issue that people are worrying about. I think some 300,000 Sri Lankans have left the country over the last 2 or 3 years. So that is 1 million people have left the country. So we have a massive brain drain which is occurring. And that's a second set of challenges. And then there's a third set of issues around, the poverty and the impatience of Sri Lankans to want to have change, social justice, but also change and better governance, right? And the government is trying to grapple with these things. So what the book tries to do is really look at these challenges and tries to make a case for a growth plan that is maintained for some time for Sri Lanka to avoid this repeated cycles of debt default, which is what countries often find themselves in. And we have a set of cases from Argentina to Greece to others, Zambia's and the Ghana's and a number of others, which have had these cycles, right? And so in the future, we will be thinking, did Sri Lanka escape this, right? And that's the question. So what we tried to do in this book was to bring together a set of experts, Sri Lankan and international people, ODI colleagues as well. And Phyllis Papadavid is over here, a colleague who has written something, and Dirk and many others, and Yunan Chen, another colleague, and Sherilyn also contributed. And we tried to understand what happened and what we should do about it, right? And so that's what the book is. And we think that Sri Lanka has a even chance, if you were a betting person, of coming out of this crisis with a good set of policies that are there for some time. Let me very briefly mention some of the material. So the book essentially covered 4 areas. We looked at debt and shocks. We looked at macro issues, fiscal policy and monetary policy. We looked a bit at trade reforms and things of this type. And we looked at implementation issues. And we had 15 essays written by this august group of people. And we tried to come up with 27 proposals. Dirk and I tried to milk every essay there was to try to find out whether we could make sense of a policy proposal that would come out. We tried to put this together. Let me just briefly show you what the book looks like. So there are basically 4 sections. And in the work on debt and shocks, we had Greg Smith, who is now a manager at the International Finance Corporation, but was before with the World Bank. And he wrote a storyline about how the debt crisis occurs in a middle-income country like this, and how the pathway to better borrowing may come out, and also dealing with the debt issue itself. We had another essay from my colleagues from the ODI that looked at private bondholder negotiations and what is the history across countries and what lessons might we take. We had then an issue on debt for nature swaps written by another ODI fellow that talks about the efficacy of this and whether this is sufficiently to get out of the debt cycle. And then we had an issue of domestic insolvency reform. There is a set of laws that are in the making, but SMEs have had a lot of difficulty existing business when they're in deep debt situations, and we have a new law that's trying to deal with this. And in section 2, we had the whole stabilization effort, and we managed to get the central bank governor, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, and the assistant governor, Chandranath Amarasekara, to write an essay with Sujitha Jagannajeevan on how the inflation menace, if you like, or the difficulty was teased out of the system. And they talk a lot about monetary policy and the efforts of the central bank, which were part of that story. Then we have a couple of papers on fiscal issues, one on characterizing the fiscal problem, the twin deficit route in Sri Lanka, which has been a bane on us. We like to essentially spend much more than we tax. And that set of issues around the fiscal issue. And then we looked at fiscal multipliers of how we might reorient the spend better to get better growth, right? And we looked at fiscal multipliers for the first time in Sri Lanka's literature. Nobody really had looked at fiscal multipliers. And then we had a set of essays in part 3 on structural reforms and trade and investment. And we have an essay by Sirimal Aberatna, who was head of the Department of Economics recently and an emeritus professor in Columbia University, looking at the whole trade liberalization story and trade agreements, and those with China, India, and many others, including the route to RCEP. And then we had an essay on looking at the problems facing FDI by another academic at Columbia University. We had some trade modeling done by myself with some other ODI colleagues, Max Perez and Johannes Ale. And we tried to look at scenarios from the economic effects of reducing trade barriers in different FTA scenarios, particularly using tariff liberalization. And finally, we had a paper there on economic diplomacy written by former Foreign Secretary Ravinath Aryasinghe, who looked at how the foreign ministry itself and its structure of overseas missions might be more effective in performing its economic diplomacy. And Ravi comes up with suggestions of a hub and spoke structure for missions, which use this wonderful resource we have of 60 missions globally to be much more effective in getting trade, investment, and attracting tourism and so on. And we talk a bit about that, and also posting specialists in some of those areas. And then there are a set of essays on implementation issues. We have Shanta Devarajan, who was acting chief economist at the World Bank, writing about governance in a very broad sense. And he makes a strong case for better repeal of the Paddyland Act and more justice around the farmer being able to choose what crops they may grow as a very important issue amongst other proposals. And we have also a paper by Indrajit Kumarasamy, who was our former central bank governor, and myself, on lessons from stabilization and some of the issues we talk about, the poverty problem in Sri Lanka, and what are some of the important things we must do, including going for growth and what the political economy around that is. And also this very important idea we bring up of how we deal with the poverty problem in Sri Lanka by trying to reduce the post-harvest losses, which are one of the contributive factors to very high food inflation, and how we must do that through cold storage and things of this kind. And we talk a bit about those. And then we have an essay on Greece. Philip David wrote about lessons that we might take. And I think one idea she had was about the reforms, and this is very important, concomitant to the stabilization phase. And finally, we have an updated paper from Dirk and myself, which bring the story right up to date and make a strong case for a growth plan. I won't go into the details of this, but you can see the 27 proposals. But essentially, they revolve around a consensus on policy for some time. We don't want the swings and roundabouts of policy that Sri Lanka has done over much of its history, but a consensus around the case for a small open economy with social justice and emphasis on inclusion and environmental sustainability amongst the political parties. And that seems very important. We talked about 3 laws, which I think Indrajit will talk about in more detail, around fiscal management, around debt, and around a central bank bill, and how these are a cornerstone of a rules-based regime, which could be a discipline on future governments so that they don't try to guess to have the twin deficits as a problem, and then this repeated cycles of debt distress going to the IMF and coming back out of it. And then we talk a bit about transformation and the structural reforms that are needed. And we go from this idea that we really need to cut a lot of the red tape and excess regulation that affects the private sector and small business and smallholders in particular. And these are stroke of the pen reforms, and we make a case for that. We also talk a lot about the national single window and trade facilitation, which is a big area for improvement. The government itself has an emphasis on digitization of public services, and the trade facilitation piece is terribly important to cut trade costs, particularly in an environment of a trade war, which we are beginning to see if we're going to become cost competitive and raise our productivity. stability. And then we talk a bit about trade agreements and how that should work and the sequencing issue. And then we talk about improving the diplomatic service and the ways they work. And then there is some issues around inclusion. We talk a bit about this repeal of the Paddy Land Act. We talked about also the food security by having much more reduction in the post-harvest losses and improving agriculture. And also this very important issue of improving social protection targeting, which is terribly important. So in summary, very rich set of essays which are available for free download, which anyone can. And we hope that people will read this, be stimulated, and think of a modern Sri Lanka which is prosperous and gets out of crisis. Thank you, Dirk.
Thank you very much, Ganesh. So, thank you very much for the brief but very comprehensive introduction of the book. I think it's good to leave a little bit of room for people to read the book. So after today, and I think we now move on to. Sorry, I told people I use the first name. You know why? The family name is too long, so I just use the first name. So Indrajit. So Indrajit. And of course, a former governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So you must know a lot of the details. Why the Sri Lanka got into that situation in the first instance. So the floor is yours. Indrajit, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me first say how grateful I am to both SOAS and ODI for inviting me to participate in this webinar. The first point I want to make is really to pick up on what Ganeshan said. Sri Lanka has made really very impressive progress in stabilizing its economy, given where it started 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, to where it is now. You know, the macroeconomic indicators of all the key ones have improved significantly. And in fact, during a remote conversation that President Anukumara Dissanayake had with the managing director of the IMF, she was moved to exclaim, "Bravo, Mr. President," on what the country had been able to achieve under the EFF program. So that's the story about stabilization. It's another story. The story is not the same when it comes to growth, poverty, etc. I'll come to that briefly later on. But let me share with you 7 learnings very quickly. I'll just give the top line, and then I'm happy to drill down for anybody who wants to know about each of them or any of them. The first learning is approach the IMF early when imbalances emerge in your economy. Sri Lanka actually it was clear that things were going wrong. 94 countries received support under the Rapid Finance Initiative, which the IMF introduced to assist countries with the pandemic. Sri Lanka applied but was not given the money. And the only reason that could have happened was because the IMF would have deemed that Sri Lanka's debt was unsustainable. Of course, they don't make a public announcement about that because then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But from that time, from I think about May, June of 2020, it was clear that at least the IMF had deemed our debt to be unsustainable. But we didn't actually go to the IMF for support till April 2022, 2 years. In 2020, the second quarter of 2020, reserves were 5 billion. When we declared the debt standstill and went to the IMF in April 2022, usable reserves were down to 20 million US dollars. So clearly, having left it to that late, the adjustment, the austerity that was going to come with the IMF program was going to be tremendously painful, and it was. So one lesson, go early. Once it becomes clear that the imbalances are becoming unsustainable. The second thing is, the second learning I'd like to share with you is the fact that Sri Lanka now has a new paradigm for macroeconomic policymaking. Why do I say that? Historically, Sri Lanka experienced repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress. And the root cause was inevitably, well, there were sometimes exogenous factors like commodity prices, but more often it was domestic mismanagement of macro policy. And the root cause was invariably the government's budget deficit. Sri Lanka ran excessive government budget deficit, and then that the kind of the pressure on prices and the balance of payment pressure that it caused was compounded by fiscal dominance in monetary policy. And the two channels through which this dominance was exercised was one, deficit financing, and two, financial repression, whereby the whole yield curve was administratively dragged down to provide cheap money to the government and to try to artificially stimulate the economy. And of course, you can't do that. From day one, it becomes unsustainable. But now, and the third point to make on the exchange rate, now all this kind of excess demand being pumped into the system through loose fiscal and monetary policies leads to BOP pressure and pressure on the currency. And invariably, the government had difficulty in adjusting the exchange rate. Because on the one hand, there's a high import component in the basic consumption bundle in Sri Lanka. And the second is, of course, if you depreciate your currency, you have to find more rupees to service your external debt. For these reasons, they artificially defended the indefensible and tried to hold the exchange rate up by depleting their reserves. And they did this again and again. And you, of course, end up with a double whammy. You deplete your reserves and you have to depreciate your currency sharply anyway. So that was the kind of playbook that was repeatedly used and caused these repeated bouts of macroeconomic stress. Now, there are two landmark pieces of legislation. One is the Public Finance Management Act, which has tightened fiscal rules. The centerpiece of in terms of the rules is the 2.3% of GDP primary surplus in the budget. And there are also targets for revenue as well as primary expenditure. So these are very, very, very tight fiscal rules have been introduced. Secondly, the central bank has been given more autonomy, and there is no treasury presence in the governance structure of the central bank. And the central bank, by law, under the new Central Bank Act, cannot finance the government's deficit, cannot participate in the primary auctions for treasury bills. It cannot give temporary overdrafts. So the government is on its own, except on very exceptional circumstances like natural disasters, pandemics, or whatever. There are some exceptions which the Supreme Court insisted should be in the act, but otherwise the government is not supported by the central bank. Government financing, government cannot count on the central bank for financing anymore. On the exchange rate, so deficit financing is knocked out by the fact that the central bank can't lend to the government. And secondly, in terms of financial repression, the central bank has adopted a regime of flexible inflation targeting. So that is data dependent, forward looking, and you can't administratively cap the interest rates anymore. So those two sources of fiscal dominance in monetary policy have been removed. And finally, under a flexible inflation targeting regime, the exchange rate becomes the primary line of defense against any external pressure. So you have to manage the exchange rate flexibly. So these two pieces of legislation have now embedded into law the kind of tying of the hands of the authorities in terms of the scope for fiscal excesses, in the scope for fiscal domination of monetary policy. So this is a completely new paradigm for macroeconomic management, which I hope will end this repeating cycle of macroeconomic stress that the country has experienced. And of course, laws can be changed, but you have to go to Parliament, argue it, and get the amendments to the legislation through. In the past, through just an instruction from the Treasury or the Presidential Office, you could have a massive, complete change of policy, which is what happened in 2019, for instance. Some of these things were actually being done under the previous extended fund facility that the country had between 2015 and 2019, but everything was reversed overnight in November, December of 2019. So that is no longer possible. You have to go through Parliament and change things. So hopefully this intentional tying of our hands will end these repeated cycles of macroeconomic stress. The third point I'd like to share with you is that graduation requires a completely different approach to fiscal and debt management. Sri Lanka, as a low-income country, received extremely generous amounts of foreign aid. A lot of it was from IDA and the Asian Development Fund on extraordinarily concessional terms, a lot of grants, the whole of a massive hydroelectric dam and electricity project, the Victoria Dam, was financed with £100 million grant from the UK government in the 1980s. So these were the kinds of support that the Sri Lanka was receiving as a low-income country. One of the reasons why this happened, why Sri Lanka became a so-called donor darling, was because it was the second country after Chile to liberalize its economy in 1977. So the traditional donors had a great incentive in demonstrating good development outcomes in a country with a liberal polity and a liberal economy. And Sri Lanka benefited from this. And every year the World Bank would organize a donor coordination meeting, and the donors would pledge to fill the external financing gap. When it was a bit unsustainable, there was an IMF program. Nothing very painful, which kind of evened things out. And there was this repeating cycle that went on. Then Sri Lanka graduated in 2010 to 2009, 2010, about that time. You kind of graduate you go to blended financing and then into commercial borrowing. So as Sri Lanka went into commercial borrowing, the change in behavior that was required did not come through. The same toxic combination of populist politics and an entrenched entitlement culture amongst the people continued. And therefore, we kept having unsustainable fiscal outcomes and all the other things I said about the macroeconomic mismanagement. And so it was almost inevitable that one was going to have this debt crisis. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you graduate, there has to be a significant difference in your behavior, particularly in terms of fiscal management and debt management. And it has to be, it's crucial that it is conscious of the compulsions that come with exposure to international capital markets and rating agencies. We were not conscious enough about that, and we didn't change our behavior sufficiently. Then the next point I'd like to make is that while Sri Lanka has done extremely well in completing its negotiations on debt restructuring. There were 5 different negotiations it had to undertake. It's done very well in getting through to the end. However, I think at this point now, it's good to take stock and ask whether the framework that the IMF used for its debt sustainability analysis has given the kind of outcomes which will get Sri Lanka out of its debt sustainability problems. Because at the end of the process, Sri Lanka will still have a debt to GDP ratio of 95%. I mean, the rule of thumb is 70 for market access countries. So is this framework strong enough? The IMF actually has been very flexible. It has done its best to try to help Sri Lanka, but we need to really now discuss at this point whether we need another multilaterally agreed framework like the common framework for low-income countries. There's an argument that it's not enough, but certainly we need to now look and see whether Sri Lanka was the guinea pig. It was the first country under the IMF's sovereign debt restructuring framework, which was used for Sri Lanka, for market access countries. IMF was the first from this particular framework that was used for the debt sustainability analysis. So we need to now take stock and see whether that framework requires adjustment. And it'll be good to see a process that goes through the G20, whereby you have a multilaterally agreed framework for market access countries, which perhaps would give better outcomes than the current framework. That's a question that needs to be discussed. Finally, let me talk about growth. Sri Lanka in the past has also done okay on the stabilization part of getting away from imbalances. We've done that before. We've completed, I think, about a dozen of our 17 IMF programs, and we would not have done that without doing stabilization okay. But we've never been able to get growth going. We haven't been able to do the structural reforms for a couple of reasons. The gestation period is long, payoff tends to take possibly more than one electoral cycle. No incentive for governments to do these reforms. Secondly, though the beneficiaries are numerous in number, there are usually a few powerful interests who have in interest in not changing the status quo. So whether it's businesses or whether it's unions, the structural reforms have been blocked. We have known what we want to do for years. I was a bag carrier to the finance minister of the time in the 1980s. And what he said about structural reforms is exactly what we're saying now. You know, factor markets, SOE reform, investment climate, investment promotion, trade policy, trade agreements, trade facilitation. I know this by heart. Education, training, and all this stuff which we talk about. We were talking about in the 1980s, but we have not got it done. This time we have to have a laser-like focus on getting it done for two reasons. Because we need at least 5% growth on a sustained basis if we are, one, to make inroads towards reversing the very sharp increase in poverty. Poverty has doubled from 13 to 25%, income poverty. And the UNDP survey found that multidimensional vulnerability has, I think, 55% of the population is multidimensionally vulnerable. So for a country with such vaunted social indicators that as Sri Lanka has had, Ganesh referred to this, we need to turn it back. We need to make inroads into reversing these trends. And for that, you need at least 5% plus growth. The second thing is you need at least 5% growth, probably more, to make sure that when we have to start repaying our debt in full, our debt obligation, the post-restructuring obligations become due in full in 27, 28. At that point, we need to have the capacity to service the capital and interest. Now we're doing only the interest, as well as finance our imports. For that, we need to have 5% plus growth from now onwards. So that will be a laser-like focus. And not only that, we need a growth model which is based much more on export transformation. When he liberalized the economy in 78, talked about export or perish. Partial success, but from 2000 onwards, exports of goods and services as a percent of GDP has halved from 35% to about 17 or 18%. The tradable goods sector, which was 75% in 2000, is now down to about 35, 36. So you can't have that kind of policy frame. You can't have a policy framework which has such an anti-export bias and then think that you can actually sustain 5% plus growth without doing these artificial macroeconomic policy interventions, which are doomed to failure from day one. So we have to do the structural reforms to get our potential growth rate up from 3% to 5%. You see, and for Sri Lanka, there's another issue. We have started aging, right? Getting old before getting rich. So growth, as you know, has two components. One is productivity, and the other is labor augmentation. Labor augmentation is no longer an option for us. So it all has to be driven by productivity growth. And for that, without these reforms, the structural reforms, that is just not possible. So the premium attached to structural reforms is even higher than it has ever been. So that the government is doing its best. It has produced a good budget. We can talk about that in the discussion because I'm running out of time. I won't go down that route. Couple of other points. One is the real opportunity for us is India, growing a $4 trillion economy, growing at 6 to 8%, depending on who you listen to. And the 5 southern states are probably growing in double digits. So, and sitting but 20 miles away, there have to be opportunities. You look at what happened in East and Southeast Asia when first Japan and then China had their growth surges. This is an opportunity that's out there for Sri Lanka. We have to find ways and means of leveraging what is happening there. There are lots of ideas about it, but that's something I just want to flag. And finally, one other point I want to make. In the current global context, we are going to have shocks. And lots of fragile economies are going to get thrown off track. And in this context, it is critical that the international financial architecture for counter-cyclical liquidity has to be strengthened. SDRs are the obvious choice, of course. I don't think the America First government is going to agree to SDRs having a bigger role, given its possible impact on the role of the dollar. But I think without that, it's going to be very difficult for a number of countries. We need to strengthen that architecture for counter-cyclical liquidity. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went on my limit.
Thank you so much. It's still not enough. We want to know more, obviously, but we can have Q&A sessions and see what kind of questions you guys have, and then we can focus on the questions. But I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Indrajit. So I think we need to move on the panel now, right? So the online speakers and Risa is here. Shall we get the online speakers ready, please? Yeah. Yeah, we already have, I can see here. Okay. We should have two, right? We should have two online speakers, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's good to go now. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Let me, Professor Alamayu, first name, and then we have Deba Praya, and
Ma'am, don't try. Call me Deb.
Thank you so much for your consideration. So, thank you very much for joining us. We are actually in a very, very constructive discussion about the Sri Lanka case, but I understand that in this panel, you are going to present some other cases. So I think we can, Risha is now in the room. So we start from Risha. Risha, you can start on your part and try to keep up, but just, go ahead.
Okay,
please.
so my name is Risa. So I'm from Seoul. So I'm a ecological economist. So I'm not an expert in macroeconomic or this policy making or finance. But today I wanted to share my thoughts with you on these issues because first time I was in Sri Lanka, it was a long time ago. I think it was in 2000, so it's more than 20 years ago. So and since then, I go there almost every year. So I have seen the country really like going through different transformation because when I was living in Sri Lanka, I was in Colombo. I was working as a student research assistant in a research institute head by a Sri Lankan prominent economist called Professor Mohan Munasinghe. I was working on renewable energy project. As Indrajit said, that time Sri Lanka was very much dependent on hydropower projects. And today I see there's much more potential for renewable energy. So I can really see the both potentials, opportunities, and challenges. And since I have only 5 more minutes, so I have done a lot of projects on Sri Lanka. But probably I will just keep my talk on tourism to keep it more focused today. So my thoughts, I have a couple of points I wanted to make. Tourism, so it's a big sector in Sri Lanka, and it is considered as a key driver for economic growth. I thought it would be perfect to talk about crisis and recovery and growth. So what could be the potential sustainable growth pattern having tourism as a driving source of economic growth there. And I have seen tourism really flourishing. When I was living there, there was not much tourism because the country was in the war. And last couple of years, since the end of the war in 2009, there's a lot of tourism, and even though they had a lot of external shocks like a tsunami, Easter bombing attack, but I really see there is a potential there because such a beautiful country. I love the country. I love the people, and there's so much to offer from such a small island. So my work on ecotourism, I looked at a specific area in Sri Lanka. It's called Sinharaja Forest. It's a part of World Heritage Sites. Sri Lanka has a lot of World Heritage Sites, but Sinharaja Forest is specifically important because it's a nature reserve rich in biodiversity. And when we talk about growth, and as Indrajit said, we need to focus on average 5% GDP growth, and the country needs those growth for debt repayment and so on. And the tourism can be an important sector to focus on. And Sinharaja Forest, I did a lot of surveys, household surveys during the COVID, and one mute. Unmute.
Carry on.
I can carry on. Okay. One thing I noticed is another point, about Sri Lanka is there's a big proportion of rural population. More than 70% of populations live in the rural area, and tourism can be an important source of income, especially for those small scale family-run and or women, marginalized groups can capitalize in this sector. And here, maybe one point I wanted to make is ecotourism, and it's of course, if we look at the GDP growth, and it's the winners and losers. What I have observed is that, especially during the COVID, of course, they were very vulnerable to those shocks because tourism numbers reduced. But also winners, losers, I wanted to talk about is more on, there are a lot of small scale farmers, but Sinharaja particularly, there are not many those small scale tourists because maybe there's not as much high profile as other areas of Sri Lanka. Like many people go to a seaside, not maybe internationally as well known. But also, I think the rural communities, we found from many different projects that community-based management of natural resources like forest and mangrove is an effective tool, but often when we talk about losers and winners in tourism, a lot of those tourism benefit is absorbed or does not particularly benefit the local economy because a lot of those big eco resorts in Sinharaja or those more organized are not owned by the local communities, but maybe more elites in Colombo or even foreign owners. So I think these issues are quite important when we talk about future sustainable growth in Sri Lanka after the crisis. You know, what kind of development path, the growth path needs to be envisioned. The rural populations and especially the youth, the opportunities are quite important to be really looked into. And also the community engagement, community-based management of, so I think those skill development, training, and those support will be quite significant. And also the country, I realize Sinharaja Forest, although it is very beautiful, it is by World Heritage organizations considered quite degrading. So I did a comparative study between Sinharaja Forest in Sri Lanka and another World Heritage site, similar, the nature reserve in Vietnam, and we realized how much the Sri Lankan Sinharaja Forest is much more degraded compared to the Vietnam similar World Heritage site, and we realized different factors we looked into, but one of the key points which was striking was that local engagement was much lower in Sinharaja compared to Vietnam, and they were not really fully engaged or involved in those ecotourism potential activities. So the local empowerment is very important. And also to mention those interesting essay series within this book, and I wanted to point it out those couple of financial instruments mentioned in the book, like nature for debt swap or green bond and blue bond, and often linked to those nature-based conservation project in an area like those virgin rainforests like Sinharaja or other mangrove areas that I also worked in other parts of Sri Lanka in Northwest in Karpitia. And I think these can be an important instruments to mobilize finance, but also my final remark is that it is important that the communities are really engaged in those processes and not just used as a financial instrument, but with very little impacts on the ground, both ecological and social. For future, I strongly believe there's a lot of potential because Sri Lanka is such a country with a very strong social capital as well as a rich natural resources. Yes, that's my final remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think definitely community things are closely crucial for growth, to be honest, the domestic growth. So, and now we are talking about similar things in terms of Africa as well. So we have online, we have Dr. Debbie. You allowed me to call you Debbie. So, right? Yeah. And he's working actually for the in the Center for Policy Dialogue. I understand you are very busy, so you cannot make it to London this time. But we are very happy to have you. So the floor is yours, please. So you are muted now. You are muted.
Yes, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever is suitable. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's an, a much more, quite a pleasure opportunity to speak on productions, the scholarly productions of my good friends, Ganesh and Dirk William. And I cannot appreciate more the work they have done and continuing the work over the last couple of years. And the second version is, or the edition is coming out, which also speaks about its relevance and its eloquence in some way. So thank you. Just to say that to put a comparative perspective between the experience of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. But I just in start, it reminds me of Tolstoy. You all know the Anna Karenina's first sentence, the celebrated volume, and that all families are happy in they are all alike, but each unhappy family are unhappy in their own way. So Sri Lanka and Bangladesh comparison brings me to the overall observation that we had been both unhappy. Maybe the unhappiness continues or lingers on, but the unhappiness had been in different ways. But nonetheless, a comparative perspective can bring out some of the common elements of this unhappiness, and one can see them at three levels. Of course, the cause of unhappiness, the manifestation of the unhappiness, and also the solution to those unhappiness. I think there are three levels of looking at it. So just to let me take up one each on these 3 points. My grandmother told me never make more than 3 points. Even the most erudite participants will never remember the fourth one. So what are the 3 points over here? The first one, what is the entry point for this discourse? There isn't. So it will be the debt discourse at the end of the day. It will be the debt discourse which captures both the external sector crisis in and some way the public finance management crisis. So but when you compare the Sri Lanka and Bangladesh situation, in both cases, the debt really exponentially accelerated in Bangladesh. In 10 years, we grew fivefold the outstanding debt, external debts, AMTEP, and half of the total debt is domestic debt. So, of course, the soaring debt in that way. But the major difference is that most of Bangladesh debt was sovereign debt. So there was no private sector debt as such. Whatever private sector debt, they are really negligible in that way. And that also not from the private capital. We didn't have private bonds or etc. So that is one part of it. The difference, other difference is that it's where these monies were invested. So, but most of it was development finance and concessional and semi-concessional development finance, and some of the suppliers credit over there. So the debt management issue and how do you solve it, of course, is dependent upon not only the growth, but also the composition of it and the terms and conditions that there are dissimilarity. I don't go into the details. The other point which needs to be pointed out in this case is Dr. Kumaraswamy referred to the debt sustainability analysis. The white paper which I led in Bangladesh on the state of the economy, one of our critiques was this whole precise IMF's debt sustainability exercise. And this whole idea that a share of your debt as a share of GDP is neither here nor there. If you do not have adequate foreign exchanges to service your debt, so even if it is low, it doesn't mean. No, if you go to Japan, 240%, you go to other countries, more than 100%, United States, I will not refer to. They have debt sustainability issue is not really calculated in that way. So I think as a share of GDP looking into it, we strongly disagree with that particular point. And this was a deceptive analysis which led Bangladesh to this thing that as if we are in the comfort zone, whereas our foreign exchange was depleting, we are not being able to service the debt. Every year, $1 billion additional servicing charge over there. So this is something which we'll have to take back on the debt analysis and its manifestation on other issues. The issue is that how do you really manage this debt? Whether you look beyond IMF, and we also went to IMF a bit early, learning from Sri Lanka. The issue is that whether you go to a debt management rescheduling exercise in one way or another, whether it is under G20 debt management approach, but that is also difficult because a large part of the debt has come from southern providers, both Russia and China, and they are not agreeable to go to a G20, of course, management system. The latest example is Zambia, I think, where they have made parallel adjustments and etc. But more so, the much more major concern is that whether it is going to affect our credibility in the world market and whether our credit rating will be downgraded because of this kind of rescheduling and other things. So while the pressure continues, Bangladesh falters on going to any kinds of debt rescheduling mechanism other than at an individual basis as we go. Let me leave the debt issue over there. The debt issue, I will come back to on the second point. That is the stabilization and reforms. The stabilization and reform issue is an old, we know the history and the empirical evidence, the trade-off issues. And in the structural adjustment period in the 90s, we have gone through this issue. And that is you stabilize the economy at a lower level, more on the demand side management over there. So but the issue is, can we really start any reforms without stabilizing the economy at a minimum level? So whether there is an interrelationship between the stabilization and the reforms, or what type of reforms one can start early and which can really go on into later on. So the approach in case of Bangladesh had been, is that to do the regulatory reforms as much as possible at the earlier stage, which may not require structural reforms in a deeper sense of the term. Bangladesh have had the other problem because most of the financial management institution or economic institutions have been totally discredited and made dysfunctional. And one of the issues had been, which is different from Sri Lanka possibly, the huge amount of illicit financial outflow. We are talking about $16 billion per annum. So how really to deal with that, and along with that, you have a dysfunctional banking and capital market system with non-performing loan overwhelming. So how do you really make those institutions? This is the sequencing issue, more functional at an early stage before you go into other kinds of stronger reforms, whether in the banking sector, merger and acquisition, or much more better, deeper reforms in the area of revenue and other cases. So that is one issue, which is where how do you really sequence the reforms in these cases? And here in case of the comparison between Sri Lanka and Bangladesh is that Sri Lanka was lucky to have much more functional institutions, economic management, regulatory system than Bangladesh. And its early rebound may be attributed to some of these issues. The second point on the stabilization versus reform issue is that how do you really make those reforms in whether if it is a contraction in monetary policy and we have the trying to coordinate between the fiscal and the monetary policy, whether these adjustment will be revenue based or expenditure based. We all agree that usually the public finance management will be critical, but between the two, whether it will be more revenue based or that creating the fiscal space through more revenue earning or cutting back on the expenditures on the public finance, on the public expenditure system, particularly on the projects, the high value projects, which were overvalued projects that we have found in this case. I hope and pray that I have no knowledge about whether the quality of public expenditure had been an issue in Sri Lanka. In Bangladesh, this had been a major issue because more than 40% of the public investment we thought was squandered away, either through direct thieving, corruption, or through overpriced projects, or through playing with the tendering process and etc. etc. So what we actually do is whether we review the public expenditure portfolio and scale back the expenditure, or we really go for a hard drive on revenue collection through various, which we have not been able. And here issue is that to what extent you go and collect more taxes from those who are already in the tax net vis-a-vis those who are not out there. And more, on the other hand, whether you improve your tax issues by doing away with the exemptions, which have very much been there that way. So that's another debate. How do you really improve upon your revenue-based adjustment or your fiscal-based adjustment? Any economist will say this is not an either-or situation on that. But the fallout of that is this is the critical part of the adjustment and reform, is that in order to carry on with some kind of reform, the market should rebound in some certain ways. Now, if you look at, if it is not there, because the private investment cannot be brought in and employment cannot be done, and there is no fiscal space for social protection, then it is a very critical circumstances within which we play around. So thankfully, in case of Bangladesh, though Ganesh was complaining about out-migration, Bangladesh is a country which strongly encourages out-migration. And there is 10 million people from Bangladesh living abroad at this very moment. And it is the remittance earning which has improved the balance of payment situation. The 20 deficit we are talking about, the fiscal deficit was under pressure, but the external deficit was controlled by the external, both by exports and all by remittances in that way. So there again, whether the two deficits move together or there is a bit of a sequencing issue over there on that. I can carry on that, but more importantly over here is how do you really get the supply side response, and that the interest rate has gone up because of the contractionary pressure, money supply has been controlled. And investment is really down, private sector investment. How do you get back on that? That issue is very, very critical. And whether you go for more borrowing at this moment with budgetary support bringing in from the IFIs, that is something which is there. My third point, the reforms and politics. If you look into the Bangladesh case, which is a bit different from Sri Lanka in many ways, is that we have seen that since the government, the earlier 15 years government, what they could not do is that improve the tax GDP ratio, which is also true for Sri Lanka up to a point. But at the same time, they also could not improve upon the private investment. So that was stagnating at 23% of the GDP. So what it went for is the marginal increase, the marginal improvement was, or expansion was on through public investment. So public investment, but no fiscal space, obviously led the country to go for more borrowing. And with the catastrophic combination with the democratic deficit, your choice, you have a moral hazard in choices of your project. You went for physically visible projects, that is infrastructure. I think Sri Lanka have at that stage also in its earlier stage. So, but on the other hand, these are, recovery period is longer. The feasibility studies were bad. And so you don't, but your time came to repay them. So this is what really created the Bangladesh problem. So the problem, one of the issues to learn is the political economy dimension of these problems. That if you do not have adequate democracy, accountability, and representation and participation, this is going to affect the reforms and assets. This brings us to this point. Sri Lanka had an interim period and then moved into an election. Bangladesh is going through that interim period, and we are struggling to what extent we do the reforms at this moment, or it will have much more broader political buy-in if we go after the elections. We see that in Sri Lanka has continued it smoothly from one phase to another. Correct me if I'm wrong. So our concern is that whether we will be able to continue with the reforms as we are doing now, once the political transition takes place on that. Colleagues, an unhappy story continues. We will have to look for the solutions for happiness for the rest of the life. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Debbie, and for very, the coverage is already very good. So we remember three issues that you mentioned. So let's talk about it later. So the next one is Professor Alamayu, and Alamayu is actually is going to talk about Ethiopia, which is very interesting. So I'm really curious to know what you are going to talk about. So please take the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to congratulate Ganesh and Derek for this excellent book, and I hope I will read it. But already it's giving us the experience of Sri Lanka, from which we can learn. The Ethiopian case is pretty much similar to the Bangladesh case just our colleague presented than that of Sri Lanka. But I just want, given the 5 minutes I have, I just want to highlight about 3 important points again. That's the magic number, I guess. So the first one is the Ethiopian problem, as Derek said, is not so much, if you use the debt sustainability indicator, not so much as the debt GDP ratio as such than the liquidity. Because the debt GDP ratio, if you use the official data, is about 33%. And the external debt GDP ratio is about 14%. And the official GDP usually exaggerates. And if you correct for that, probably it is 45%, the debt GDP ratio. So it's not a big deal. But the liquidity ratio, the debt to export ratio is almost 300%. And that's the fundamental problem, because Ethiopian imports are almost 6 times larger than its exports. And Uh, Now, this basically led has structural factors. For a long period of time, there was a structural deficit. Exports is not diversified. It's very small, $3.5 billion in the last 10 years on average, while imports on average is $18 billion, so 6 times higher. And this is commodity dependence, coffee and a few commodities, so therefore vulnerable for shocks. And then low saving because of poverty, therefore domestic resource mobilization very small. And then add to that conflict, and illicit financial flows. I calculated in the last 10 years there are $45 billion capital flight from the country. And when you have conflict, the illicit financial flows will increase. So in this structural condition, the country came unable to pay its debt. In fact, defaulted on its Eurobond, which would have been easy to pay actually. It was 33 million. But more importantly, it cannot pay the official debtors because on the average, the debt servicing is about 50% of the exports. Well, on the average, 1.7 billion in the last 5 years, while the export is about 3 billion. So they have the government has to ask for rescheduling, and then almost reserve is left for a couple of weeks, so they don't have a choice but to accept the IMF program. And now the program started running and foreign inflow started to come, but at the cost of that adjustment is huge austerity policy with its implication both for investment, which was primarily governed by public investment as our Bangladesh guide told us, and also the spending on social sector declined sharply. From the spending on the public sector was about 60%, now declined by 50% to 30%. And debt servicing payment becomes the top in public expenditure item, being larger than the combined spending on roads and education, which means spending on the social sector is declining. Now, this is in the context where the multidimensional poverty is about 70%. And, if you use $1 a day, almost 70% are below poverty line. So the social cost is huge. Already the austerity policy means fertilizer price, for instance, right now has doubled because of the floating exchange rate. Utility costs and everything, which supports the poor has been basically slashed. So the social cost is huge, number one. Number two, because of the, again, tight monetary policy and credit squeeze, I see serious contractionary effect of the. So as a result, right now it is in a major problem. There is credit crunch in the economy. This is aggravated by a conflict. So now, what would be the solution in this context? What are we going to do? I don't have. I think what would have been, in my view, is to be done is number one. Already the government has a month ago an agreement with official creditors, which is good news. But what kind of spending will it be allowed? Number one, is there a possibility of serious rescheduling, probably also debt relief, and at the same time avoid the leakage in terms of debt service, but direct that to address the structural problems that led to indebtedness in the first place, especially on exporting and growth. So I think in Ethiopia, the condition is right now like that. Now, what is the implication of this in the context of the Sri Lanka, Bangladesh story we just heard? I just want to, given my limited time, I just want to say 3 things. Number one, the debt sustainability analysis needs, I think, reforming. This needs reform because it doesn't really capture the structural factors that led to indebtedness in the first place. So it should be probably this. I'm thinking even for an African level, it doesn't capture, our major drivers of indebtedness. We did 3 comprehensive studies. That's what we found. That is important to stimulate growth. We found in Ethiopia, for instance, in the short term, debt creating flows lead to growth. But in the long term, in the medium term, because of the debt burden, the growth effect is negative. So that implies that there is a redirecting to structure to address redirecting the debt creating flows to address structural issues. Number 2, efficiency of public spending, also corruption and what have you, and debt management. And that's the second one. Then probably we need to address also the contractionary effect of austerity, especially in the social sector, because this can lead to it might have social political implications. That's what I have to say. I don't want to take a lot of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Alamayu. And we got quite a lot of information about that specific country. And as you see, it's a very difficult chair today. We are already running out of time, but I tried from Dirk, but we did not. But we are already running out of the time, so we probably need to postpone the Q&A session. We will add more time, but I just hope people enjoy this discussion because it's really, really interesting. It's really important, and we do not have this occasion very often. So I'm sorry, but we need to keep on going. So and we do have some online questions as well, very interesting questions actually. So the next session, so thank you very much. And the next session will be something like a specific finance orientated with a little bit general knowledge about the theories, the knowledge behind this debt default issue. And I think Phyllis has a very strong background, so let's start and
Sure.
yeah,
Sure.
start with your
Sure, I'll try and be brief, given that we're running over time. It's lovely to be back at SOAS. I'm a former student here years ago. Forgive my voice, I'm struggling with laryngitis, but hopefully we'll make it through. It's a really important time to be thinking about finance and debt issues and economic transformation. As Indrajit said, the shocks are not going to stop. They're going to keep on coming. Not all negative. There's some positive shocks. Not all commodity producers struggle when there's a commodity price shock. But it is a very important time to think about finance, and especially when crises become acute. In our work at the moment, we're looking at the impact of financial inclusion and how that impacts future growth patterns. And in looking at the data, there's actually something very interesting. We've seen a bifurcation in the data. So in looking at credit to the private sector and its link with GDP growth, just in middle-income countries, there's a subset that actually credit growth has skyrocketed, but GDP per capita is quite low. And there's a second subset in that data set of middle-income countries that credit growth to the private sector has also skyrocketed, but actually GDP per capita has done quite well. And so we're looking at what the difference is between those two countries. What are the factors behind countries that have done well, that have seen good economic growth when credit growth, when debt rises? And so I have a magic 3 as well. What constitutes meaningful access to financial services? So not just bank accounts. We're talking about digitally enabled access to finance at scale. That's number 1. And it has knock-on impacts on trade, for example, as we've seen in countries like Vietnam that has a huge trade to GDP share. The second set of tools that we're looking at quite closely, particularly for the lower middle income countries, and the absence of this, is insurance. So tools related to insurance and their wide-scale use and how they stabilize poverty. They're poverty stabilizers, so they arrest poverty when you introduce these kinds of insurance instruments in trade, in the agriculture sector. The third group, which is related to some work we're doing with onshore, offshore foreign exchange markets, is just to see the deposit and savings base grow in a stable, solid, broad-based way. That then catalyzes broader liquidity in the markets. It encourages depth, breadth, and scale in the financial markets. So that's the third thing. So the countries that have seen credit growth rise and economic growth in terms of GDP per capita rise, they've tended to have two or more of these three policies with, as you said, Indrajit, a laser-like focus. So our experience in Greece, my experience in Greece, just to link back to the book, has been that in acute crises, and Greece's crisis was acute and long, it was almost a decade, what they're doing now is they're laser focused. So they're not distracted by other things like, well, we had a huge debate in the ministry around growth versus fiscal austerity, which one they should be focused on more. But they're laser focused on debt sustainability and inclusion, financial inclusion. So they are putting in place incentives for new firms to set up and for international money to invest in new firms in Greece. So I would say a laser-like focus, if we're taking away from Greece experience, and this sort of very targeted coordination of different stakeholders to mobilize finance. So they are proactively targeting regulators that need to be involved, heads of banks, the policymakers, and the different key ministries that need to be involved. And it's in a very targeted and coordinated way, just to pass one change, one bill, what have you. And they're doing this in a sequential way so that they never have a crisis like this again. Those are my points, but what has been of interest to us at ODI in taking forward this work has been the sort of not micro, but the differences within the middle income status. What are the key triggers between a lower middle income to upper middle income? What accounts for that successful transition? And of course, then, higher income category. I'll pause there and then pick it up in Q&A.
Thank you so much.
worries.
It is very concise and informative as well. And that three things.
Magic three.
Yeah, magic number today. So we now have Dirk again to actually have an overall summary of whatever we have heard and what else that maybe you have something to add. And Dirk is now.
Yeah, thank you. Let me briefly speak in 3 points as well. I think, although what Deb does is has 3 sub-points to it. Yes. Let me just keep just three points. So I think one issue is that we need to understand the causes of debt and what has happened. And I think both in the case of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, we've had rapid increase in debt over the last 5-10 years or prior to the crisis, and we need to understand that better. What we've heard from the panel is also that crises are going to stay here, so we need to keep monitoring that very well. So is there going to be another sudden increase in debt somewhere in the country? What's going on? We need to be quick at analyzing that. And it's not just the level of debt; it's also the composition in terms of debt. I think also what is important here is that it's not just debt GDP, but it's also liquidity, right? So you need to have liquidity, and so debt GDP is maybe a signpost for some countries, but for other countries it's something else. So in Bangladesh it was something else, and also in Ethiopia as well. It was also it was liquidity and foreign exchange availability, and so monitoring that and understanding what the causes of crisis is an important topic that we may want to discuss. Secondly. There are international issues here that came to the forefront. I think all of us had something to say about the IMF and the DSA. I think that sustainability framework or the sustainability analysis, particularly Bangladesh and Ethiopia. So what are the factors and the measures that they look at? And I think there's also a review ongoing anyway of this, and we've already contributed that last year around this, and sort of what are the forecasts of the IMF? Are they right? Are they the right ones? Do they put onus on fiscal restraint or on something else? And the implication of that is going to be important, but also, but at the same time, also it's been particularly helpful. The IMF has been particularly helpful as well in a number of cases. In Sri Lanka, for example, is that it bought time. But it's important now to move to the next stage. And that's thirdly, my final point is we know that we need to engage in reforms. There will be different types of reforms. Even within an IMF program, you can have different types of reforms. The IMF program doesn't say you need to do this or that. There's some outcome variables that it says, so you need to build reserves and so on, but it doesn't tell you exactly how to do it. And so there's freedom there, right? So there's a lot of freedom that you can think about. And within that context, it's very important to, we heard from I think, everyone is also about reforms and politics. And there's a fine line there. So, and that is basically the sequencing. What sequencing? What can we do when? Which reforms do we do when and how? In what context? That's going to be important. So the participation. And secondly, the reforms aren't just about maximizing trade and finance. It's also about how trade fits in and how finance fits in as well. That's what Philip's saying. Also, basically the coordination of actors. How does international finance come in? And so I think there's a rich agenda going forward there that we need to discuss. Is basically what do we do? So once we have some basic stabilization. Without stabilization, you probably can't do the reforms, right? Although the reforms may help you to stabilize, but there's a lagged effect. So you need to stabilize, and then how can you then best use that? And I think that's something that we're going to focus on a lot at ODI in the future, is to think through that context of using the space that's been created by the stabilization to think about the future types of growth. Let me stop there because I think we want to hear from some of the Q&A.
Yeah. So now we can actually have our Q&A session, and which I think will be interactive, more interactive. And I'm aware that we have people from online and also in the room to be more inclusive. So I start with at least the first question. Shall I start with online? Is that okay with people? So let me. I have seen a few questions here, and particularly I have a friend who is called Ghana online, and I saw your questions are really relevant. So do you accept that if I gave you the floor, that you can show yourself on the screen and asking your question? It's not possible? It is possible. We checked that. No? Okay. Yeah, okay. So in that case, okay. So let me pick up one question from Ghana, and this question is read like this. So I heard, actually, I do not know which speaker, but I heard the speaker mentioned that there is a need for a new framework, probably from interject, yeah. So a new framework in the negotiation for FFD4, which
Financing for development.
oh dear. Okay. So, and then it continues like the African group is suggesting a debt restructuring mechanism under the UN with the support from countries in Asia and LAC. What does LAC mean?
LAC?
Latin
Can-
Latin American probably. It's not a London school. So what do you think about that proposal? I think they focused on the second part, and you mentioned the framework, but they apply this to African countries, and they want to negotiate with the UN with the support from some countries in Asia and Latin America. So the question is, what do you think about that proposal?
You asking
May I
me?
come in?
Oh, yes. Can you? Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. You see the FFD document now, there was the zero.
Oh, sorry.
It is.
Debbie, so we need to see you on this on the screen, please. Yeah. So it's Debbie. It's Debbie who is speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Ma'am, Deb, my name is Deb, and Deb means God in our language. So, and God sometimes becomes visible too.
Okay.
So the issue is that it's a very good question. And I thought of referring to the FFD4, the Financing for Development Conference, which is going to happen soon in Seville, in Spain. The zero draft was out. The text-based negotiation need to be there, but now the first draft is out. One of the issues which is new, which much more strongly coming after the Addis and the earlier version is the debt management issue. So debt distress is now an across the board systemic concern, not only Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, but much more possibly in sub-Saharan Africa and even beyond, even with developed countries. I won't go to Greece or others. So, or Latin America, Argentina included. So the issue is, how do you really deal with it? The interesting part of it is that we have argued, along with the developing countries, least developed countries, and G77 and China, that to have it in an UN system. So there are colleagues first, the dissension is that not under UN, but we don't have anything, either IMF and the World Bank, IMF and IFIs are on that. But there is also internal problem because a large part of the debt is attributable to southern countries, whether it is Middle East, China, Russia, and India included. So there is also that whole point whether they would subject themselves to that kind of governance. So there is an internal issue, and there is also an external issue in terms of, and this will also relate to the whole debate of multilateral banks development or the reform debate, which is currently going on the side at the same time. So this is an issue which has to be there, but there is a general agreement. Debt is a major issue now globally. It is not only a developing country issue or low income country issue. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are both middle income country. So that is something we will see how it plays out as the text-based negotiation goes on. So there is a push from the developed countries, OECDs. There is also a push from some of the southern countries.
Thank you very much, Debbie. And I think we probably have some addition from Do you have any comments?
No,
Indrajit?
yeah, no, I'll certainly endorse what Professor Bhattacharya has said, and just add that, you know, we do have a common framework for low-income countries, which was agreed by the G20. And the advantage, as he pointed out, of going through the G20 process, that it usually has greater traction in the IMF, World Bank, the multilaterals. But I think probably it's best to start with the financing for development because it has a larger membership, and perhaps the different voices from the South can all be expressed more tellingly within the financing for development framework. But the important thing, I think, is one is to strengthen the common framework for low-income countries and to come up with a new framework for middle-income countries, for market access countries, as they're called, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think now I come to the room, people in the room. I will collect three number. That's a magic number. So 3 questions for the first round and see what happens. So yeah, I saw your hand actually last time. So you start, and then that gentleman and that colleague here. Yeah. Maybe you can introduce you can tell us your name.
I think I can do without this one. It was planned even before the war ended that the war-torn North and East would be hyper-militarized for PSYOPs. And it is still going on for the last 16 years. Army is doing most of the economic activities. And what about their development? What about their future? What about the future of the people in the North and East? I went to Jaffna 2 months back, and I went to the district secretariat, Jaffna district secretariat.
Sorry, can I ask you, focus on your question. So what is your question?
Okay.
Summarize your question, please. Yeah.
Because it was planned that the war-torn North and East would be hyper-militarized for PSYOPs. What is the future of the people?
Can I
Big
respond?
question.
I think from my
Sorry. So we
Want
collect
to
the
take-
questions,
yeah.
yeah, and then but you are ready for them. So can we have the second question, please? Yeah.
Yeah, I thank all the panelists for the input. My name is Charit from the Institute of Political Economy. One of the questions that really wasn't touched, I think, is the real elephant in the room, which is the unjust nature of the global economic order. So we have after the Bretton Woods Agreement process where the IMF and World Bank and stuff were set up, but the whole purpose of that was to ensure global financial stability and poverty alleviation. And the record of that has been appalling. Today, we have 53 countries or more even who are under severe debt distress. And we don't seem to be talking about the issue with that system. After the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID crisis, there was a massive amount of monetary financing around the world. And lots of private creditors have got enormous amounts of money through that process.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the numbers that have gone on, all the sovereign debts have gone up after the financial crisis.
The question is?
Question is, should we actually really address that issue? Not talking about framework changes, small adjustments, but really talking about how do you tackle that global economic order? Because countries of the global south will always be in this trap because it's designed to be like that.
Okay, thank you very much. So we collect the third question over there, please.
Hello. Hi, my name is Anand. I'm a student at SOAS. Congrats on the book. My question is, I think all the speakers spoke about the stabilization has worked very well. I think the next big thing is how to achieve growth. And I think in the book, mainly it was mentioned around export and free trade agreement and so on and so forth. And one of the speakers mentioned that Sri Lanka was a basic needs success, or at least in the 70s. And if you remember the 2022 crisis, one of the things was like, there was no papers for conducting exams in Sri Lanka and so on and so forth. So my question is, I think there's been a lot of talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy, but what about the production strategy? Like what kind of production strategy or let's say industrial policy is Sri Lanka going to focus on to achieve this kind of growth, especially the export growth? Tied to that question is because there was, I think one of the speakers mentioned about the central bank not going to fund the fiscal deficit. So how is this, if there is an production strategy, how is that going to be funded? In the book, there was mention about national development banks. If you could expand on it, that'd be good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have 3 questions, and I will leave the first question to interject? And I open the floor for the other two questions, because of the other two, so I think everybody can have some insight. So please, we start with interject, please. Yeah.
On the first question, madam, there I think things have changed quite a lot. In my lifetime, I never expected for the northern province to vote for 3 parliamentarians from a southern party. I never thought that would happen in my lifetime. But the fact that 3 MPs now from the northern province are from the government party, that is a remarkable change in my view. And I think it reflects some of the changes in the government's policies as well. They have actually opened up a number of roads. If you're talking about the military domination, I don't think you can expect the military to move completely away, but it has been reduced. The military presence has been reduced. Number of roads have been opened up. In addition, the KKS factory has been restarted, the cement factory. The Jaffna airport is being turned into an international airport, and tourism has picked up and can pick up more. And if you look at the budget, the North and the East have got their fair share of money in terms of education, health, etc. So I think one thing this government has done is to really, change the whole narrative in terms of moving away from nationalistic policies. And it has also walked the talk. If you look at the budget and the projects it's undertaking in the North, the fact that it is opening up some roads, etc., which were closed down, and the kind of reception that the president, etc., get when they go to the North, it is dramatically different from anything that we've seen since the 60s. I think probably when Kobekadua went up there, and he was, because of his agricultural policies, the way he was received, since then, no Southern politician has got the kind of reception the present government is getting, particularly His Excellency, the President. So things have changed. I think we need to recognize that. And in terms of, take this other question, or on the National Development Bank, etc.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Briefly, yes.
Yeah. So the industrial policy, I think, clearly the government's political philosophy is such that it would be open to industrial policy where possible. And clearly, if it is to be implemented, it needs to be implemented with the kind of discipline the East Asians did. It's fine to have industrial policy, in my view, but in our case, it is not time-bound. It is not, there are no conditions attached to performance, the kind of things that the East Asians did and then successfully implemented industrial policy. That is not something that has been seen in industrial policy implemented by Sri Lanka in the past. So yes, industrial policy, but it needs to be done in a disciplined way. And the government has identified a number of priority sectors. Agriculture, I mean, Ganeshan is better the place than I am. Maybe he can talk about that as to what the government's priorities are in terms of driving growth.
Yeah, so now, Ganesh, you already
Thank you.
Transferred. Yeah.
Thank you. So the first 2 sectors, I think, would be pretty much doable in Sri Lanka's current competitive advantage. One is tourism, and tourism you've talked about, and I think that's a sector that's very important both from a revenue earner. The country is getting some 3 million tourists, we think, this year, and will exceed that, and that would be a big benefit. The other bit of the tourism sector is, what I understand is that more than half of the sector is MSMEs, very small things. So if you get that growing and much more linkages, you will have lots of spillovers that may come. And I hope it will be island-wide. And that, I hope, will be also one of the things that will also come with the North and East and the Deep South being pulled into that. And tourism is a very important thing. Second one, of course, is agro-processing. So we have to add value addition into agriculture. And I think that becomes very important. We've sort of done that in bits and bobs. We've put high-value tea. We've done something with cinnamon and spices, but I think we can do a lot more. For instance, we export the raw tuna basically to Tsukiji, to Japan. And we export the raw crabs to Singapore. And I think we could add value to that. So I think those are 2 very important things. On the industrial policy, though, I think the problem we have is we don't really have the institutions to do this. And we need to really think of a better organized trade industrial structure The Board of Investment, I think, needs some reform, particularly away from just managing industrial estates to better investor targeting. We need to think a lot more about the MSME ministries and how they function. So, and really a lot of that is human capital, right? And we don't really have the skill set. And so there's a big risk of government failure. And so I'll just stop there right now. Thank you.
May I just give a quick footnote? Sorry.
Yeah, of
The
course
National
you-
Development Bank.
Yeah,
Asked
yeah.
about the bank. Yeah. So the important thing is to have development banking capacity, not necessarily a new institution, because new institutions are very difficult to set up. And whether we have the expertise to have a new, but there is legacy capacity in the NDB, National Development Bank, and the Development Finance Credit Corporation. So to use the legacy capacity and perhaps some new capacity in existing institutions. But the real challenge is the maturity mismatch. Our banks raise their deposits on basically on 1 year deposits. And we are asking them to lend 5, 7 years. That just will not happen. You know, unless so, what you need to do is to attack that maturity mismatch by mobilizing long-term financing. Now, possible sources are the ADB, maybe Japan. So that's what happened. When the development banks were there, when the FCC and NDB were development banks, there used to be long-term credit lines from the World Bank and the ADB, which then, addressed that maturity mismatch. The ideology during the Reagan-Thatcher era, that those lines of credit are no longer available from the multilaterals. But maybe Japan is possibly. So you need to get long-term financing and use existing capacity, which is already there.
Yeah. So that requires the development of financial system
Yes.
of the country
Yes.
and to mobilize.
Ma'am, may I come in?
Yes, can you
Ma'am.
do that very brief? Can you
Yes,
do
very
that?
brief.
Yeah.
I think on the point of, this fiscal prudence and the in terms of the monetary policy and not printing money. So Bangladesh promised that it will not print money, and it wanted to under the IMF loan, and we thought that is profligacy in many ways. But we could not keep the promise. We couldn't keep the promise because we have to go for printing. But the difference was earlier it was done at stealth. Now it is disclosure has happened. The issue is that if you do not really, the issue is about those supply side response. If you do not have supply side response, which relates to investment and creating more revenue and creating more fiscal space, and the banking system, on the other hand, is very dysfunctional. The institutional reform has not taken place, which is also not very easy to do when the stabilization is yet to be there. So as a result, the deposit goes down, but the demand for private investment could not be filled in by liquidity. So the central bank resorted to printing money once again on that. Obviously, it has inflationary implications and many other things, but this is again, those are the hard choices between whether how you finance your private investment under a moderately contractionary policy, but at the same time, you have to print money whereas your banking system remains dysfunctional. The bottom line is that we cannot really look at one policy in isolation. It's a combination of policies and the coordination of the policy, and whether we have that mechanism of coordination, or whether within the banking system or in the finance ministry, that is a challenge as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I think we need to answer the second question. I think the question is important. Think about the international financial system, think about those aid, those organizations. It has been there for so long, but we still see the debt default problem in developing, in emerging market and developing economies. So I think the question is, how shall we reform this? Do we need to reform them, right? Is that the question? So can we say something about that? So we cannot avoid it. And this is basically a very fundamental issue, external issue for those highly indebted countries. Dirk, maybe.
Maybe first of all, I suppose I think it's a valid question and a valid point, an important point as well. I also know that, Deb is actually the best place to talk about this. He was the chair of the Southern Voice for about 10 years or 5 years, thinking about the Southern Voice in the global economic order. And I think with ODI, and I think so of course as well, but thinking about the importance of global economic order, that's a key question. What we know is that it takes a long time. right? This is not something that you can change very easily, right? And so I don't think you can rely solely on that. I do agree that we need to keep suggesting that there needs to be a new debt default mechanism, that we need to think more about how to sort of regulate sovereign bondholders, and thinking about how that affects market access if you start negotiations. But I think it just takes a long time, and now we're in a cycle where we have another onslaught on the global economic order, where I'm just not hopeful that that globally we can resolve a lot of things. I think bilaterally a lot of things can happen, and I think in the book also we say how India has helped Sri Lanka at a crucial time. There are other cases in other countries where, and also Ethiopia, there are one or two countries that have just had a 3 billion credit line. So bilaterally and within groups, you can sort of think through, well, maybe we can sort something out and we can develop it. And I think that's probably helpful to do. But multilaterally, and keep going, I would say, and we keep going, because with ODI we do that. But I think we also have to think about the payoff there, and that in the meantime you have problems. You have poverty increasing, and multilateral institutions aren't doing anything or not enough. I mean, they're helping. The IMF are helping and so on. But I think it's important to also be pragmatic about this. So that may be my answer on the global economic order. I focus a lot on trade issues and myself at ODI, and I think it's really important to think through what can be done at the moment on trade. I don't think we should respond by U.S. self-harm with collective self-harm by everybody else, also increasing tariffs. That should definitely not the case. So we need to sort of see what can we do, in this current context. The other point about the production strategy, I think, is really important, and I think Ganesh already answered the question there. So the industrial policy isn't one that is an old style protectionist industrial policy. That doesn't work. That's been shown not to really work. And in fact, there are also in the case of Sri Lanka, there are quite a lot of subsidies that are affecting production strategies, so often in a negative way as well. But I think the important there is to be proactive and to help and to facilitate investment, to facilitate production structures, to be able to sort of coordinate to solve problems. So if an investor wants to come in, it needs skills or it needs infrastructure, then try and solve that. And that needs a lot of institutions, as Ganesh was saying, and slowly building up those sort of institutional capabilities is an important part of industrial policy. And I think that's an important piece of a growth plan, I would say, as well as reforms that need to happen as well. Let me stop there because I don't want to. I think we're close to the end now, isn't it?
I want to see the demand side. Do we still have more questions? If we do, I will have another round with that three magical number. So yes, and the second one.
I don't know if it's on, but I think you can hear me. So my question is, how should we view the National People's Allied Power Alliance? I mean, they have got a very strong mandate in elections and seem to be having a bit of a honeymoon so far in terms of the electorate and the IMF going forward. But it's quite likely there'll be rougher times going ahead. Should we view it as a sort of extension of the JVP party or potentially more unruly alliance going forward? I mean, you've concentrated 5 or 6 of the most important portfolios of the president and the prime minister. I mean, I think all the finance, the defense, trade, interior, is that a sign of a very concentrated leadership, or is it a sign of limited experience of governing? I don't think anyone has been in government before either of these. It's primarily through Ganesh and Indrajit, but also welcome the views of others. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we already have the supplier here. So let's have the second question. Yeah, there.
Hi, I'm a student here at SOAS. Just have a quick question on a comment that Dr. Kumaraswamy made on the fact that a lot of the time the reforms in Sri Lanka have been held back by the fact that there are, vested interests or few powerful actors resisting that. And I think my question is partly how do you overcome that problem? And secondly, whether the panelists' thoughts on whether currently, I think maybe with the NPP coming into power, maybe there has been somewhat of a shift where it creates a better, like more conducive environment. Do you think so? Or do you think that these problems are still going to persist?
Thank you. And do we have the third one? Okay, we do have the third one. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gisela from Embassy of Ethiopia. So in Ethiopia, the big debate was that whether to float the financial sector, I mean to liberalize the financial sector and whether to liberalize the foreign exchange rate where the economy is at its low level and there is some sort of instability and whether, I mean, at the same time, when the foreign reserve is at low level, or whether the government has to wait until the economy recovers and the foreign reserve is up. So would you comment on which way to go and when to decide to making reform until whether to wait until the economy recovers or to make it any reform anytime? Yes.
So you are talking about the Ethiopia, your country, or in general? Yes, so Awan, shall we answer this set of questions? So we already have that three. And I think Ganesh is going to start with the first question like this.
Sure.
And then go.
So what you have is really a party that said certain things on the stump with the election campaign, and now they're in government, right? And there's a sobering story, and they've kind of gone back to the core principles of the NPP. One is the anti-poverty stance, which they have done by trying to tweak the IMF program. And they were lucky to have a bit of fiscal space to be able to give a few more things on the welfare. And the recent budget also tried to provide some relief measures. So the anti-poverty thrust is quite clear. The second bit is they talked about, dealing with the anti-corruption and governance issues, which you've had some historic problems. And by example, the president himself has cut all the perks down for himself and the Prime Minister, but across the MPs. And that's a very good sign, and it's percolating down the system. As to the concentration of power question, the executive presidency that we've had in Sri Lanka has really been a blight on our governance. I mean, when I look at it, the argument that was made in 1977 was that this would give the ability to push through reforms. But unfortunately, it's been tainted by, I would say, non-democratic governance mostly. Concentration of power, plus, broadly speaking, a lot of inefficiency and then rent-seeking behavior. And so the NPP, I think, most recently are talking about constitutional reform, and I think they did say they will abolish the executive presidency, right, Indrajit? And this concentration, by the way, of power in a few officers' state is something we have done ever since the executive presidency. It's nothing new. So I think they've kept broadly the consensus that we think has been theirs, and you see that in the bounce of the economy and things of this type. We haven't seen dramatic changes so far, and one hopes that this will kind of continue in some way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So do we have any? So
Yeah,
can we do that very briefly? We are running out of time. I'm ordered to.
I must say I very much agree with the thrust of Ganeshan's remark. Couple of things. I think they've been very pragmatic, and I think the continuity we've seen in Sri Lanka, it's not often that you see continuity of policies across governments. And we're under 3 presidencies now in terms of commitment to the IMF program, in terms of debt restructuring. There has been consistency, and the NPP government has continued. And I think, as Ganeshan said, they produced a good budget. They were able to find money to have a record allocation for health in nominal terms, a record allocation, and they're close to the 5% target they had in their manifesto for education, and they found more money for cash transfers. So in terms of their priorities, they were able to find more money. And they had a 4% of GDP allocation for capital expenditure, which for Sri Lanka is a pretty ambitious one. And if they're able to implement, That will be a major achievement in my view, and also growth positive. The other thing is corruption vulnerability has definitely come down, particularly amongst the politicians. It needs to now percolate down, but hopefully because the tone at the top, as Ganeshan pointed out, has improved significantly, that we will see it percolating down the system as well. There is one very obvious case where you can see how things are improving. You know, the governance and procedures around onboarding projects into the public investment program completely broke down. You know, the president's ministers just got projects any old how and chucked it in, and it, you know, often it was the size of the commissions that determined whether or not they were onboarded. Now we have gone back to a more structured system. There will be proper scrutiny, and this also caused the debt. It was a contribution to the debt crisis as well, because we took on all these projects without proper scrutiny. And this government is committed itself to going back to more evidence-based policymaking. You know, we had barely a nodding acquaintance, actually, with you know, data-driven, evidence-based policymaking. They are going back to that. So these are all positive things. But it's early days still. But they need to execute. That's the thing, whether they have the capacity and experience to execute. And they have actually said, the president in the budget speech said that he would implement the Economic Transformation Act with some amendments. That has a lot of stuff on FDI, trade, etc. So if he is able to execute that with this laser-like focus that we talk about, then I think that will actually be a major advance.
Yeah, so I'm so yes, so Professor Alamayu is not online anymore, so probably the question on Ethiopia cannot be answered properly, because I do not think we can. You called him back.
Question.
No, my question is the directly in Ethiopia of that one, but my question is
It's a general question.
But my question is the general comment for everyone, not for specific.
I mean, I can make a quick comment.
Please,
Just
yeah.
my previous.
Phyllis.
So, I mean, if reserves are declining dramatically, you just can't keep a fixed exchange rate. I mean, it's not sustainable anyway. So, it's best for the economy to stabilize before you make any changes or impose any controls on the currency, I would say. That's just a general comment.
Yeah.
Sri Lanka again and again has tried to maintain the currency. Each time we end up actually having a big depreciation, and we've lost reserves in the same time. So
and that is connected to the second question.
That happens again. It happened again and again in Sri Lanka.
Yeah. So I do understand. So I think we are really running out of time. So because I'm aware that we need to leave for each speaker, so now you have 2 minutes to make a summary and to highlight something that you think people should take home. And now I give the floor to the speakers. Shall we start from Dirk? Ganesh, do you prefer me to start from Ganesh, please? Yeah. So really 2 minutes within.
So I'll just make really 3 points in the magical way. The first is Sri Lanka will go down in a remarkable experience of stabilization. And I think the role of the central bank in that process should not be underplayed while we think of the IMF. And so domestic policy is very much concomitant with international policy. And I think that's very important. The second point I want to make is really about this very difficult business of reform. And I think we need to do this, and it's got to be in place for some time. And it really has to be an export or perish mentality, meaning it has to be outward-led policy, because the domestic market is only 22-odd million people, and the energy of growth isn't there. And the connection with India is particularly important. And we have Mr. Modi in Sri Lanka in a couple of days' time. and he's coming with a huge delegation, and they're talking a lot about connectivity between the two countries. And I think that's going to be very important for Sri Lanka to take advantage of the 6-7% Indian growth, which will be a driver. The last point I want to mention is that through this work, we are helping Sri Lanka in the future, and we are hoping to do a growth plan through a study group exercise, which Dirk will talk about a bit more. And I think we will continue to engage in this debate and provide expertise both nationally and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Risa?
Yeah. So I'll be really quick, but yeah, first of all, I want to congratulate Ganesh and Derek for this amazing work to edit all these interesting and comprehensive papers. And what I really learned is that I think for the future forward, I think it's really the importance of this political economy part needs to be really also addressed, and that's also discussed in this events today, that those countries are heavily indebted. Also, I think somebody said that they designed to be in this position. I think, this larger political power dynamics, I think it's also, not just a national policy and other surrounding this trade and other linkage, but also I think it's bigger, this structural issues embedded in this driving all these countries to default under those crises.
Thank you. So interject, please.
Okay, just a couple of points. One is, I think one of the key things in terms of the success in stabilizing the economy so far has been, as Ganesh pointed out, the appointment and the continuation in office of the governor of the central bank and the secretary of the treasury. They have played an outstanding role, both of them. And in my view, they're former colleagues, so I know their caliber. They're excellent. And the fact that 3 successive presidents kept them in place, which is not, doesn't happen in Sri Lanka, has been, I think, a major factor in terms of the success of the stabilization. The second thing is that consensus. I think this has been mentioned, but let me just reinforce it. If you look at the high-performing Asian economies, the thing that is common across all of them is consistency in the overall economic strategy. And in Sri Lanka, we have not had that consensus, and we are constantly pulling in different directions. And we need to get that consensus. And the fact that we've maintained it across 3 presidencies, I hope bodes well. People say, well, in the other high-performing Asian economies, a lot of them were one-party states or military governments when they did their economic transformation. But Sri Lanka is a democracy, and it's not easy to do that. But I would cite the example of India. India had its major crisis in 1991. It is a fiercely contested polity. And despite that, since they went to the IMF once in 91, never been there again. We have been there 17 times. And really, for me, the secret is the kind of broad consensus in the overall economic framework that has existed between the BJP and the Congress. And that is where we need to get to. I hope we are beginning to get there, as we are beginning to see some consistency across governments in the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, Felice, please.
Just taking stock of different countries' experiences, post-crisis economies in acute debt distress or moderate debt distress. I think 2 key things are important to keep in mind and perhaps prioritize. One is realism. So, talking about Greece briefly, when they were just at the start of their crisis, there was no realistic assessment of the debt sustainability. So that delayed getting help and the way in which they got help and financing. So I think countries that are struggling at the start of a crisis or with debt risk, there needs to be a very realistic analysis of their debt prospects, not just by one party, but by several parties. And then the second thing is resilience. So in the environment of instability and uncertainty that we're in, I think most efforts need to be targeted towards resilient growth and resilient financial systems.
Thank you. And Dirk, you want to do your summary and then do the another.
No, not another. I just will find a final comment. I think that's probably because I know we're at the end, and I thank you so much for staying with us, and also there's still 40 out of the 80 people online. I think so. Thank you so much. I mean, I think what really stands out is that Sri Lanka has turned a corner, but it's definitely not there. And I think that is something that we all need to be thinking about. So we've collectively sort of gone along a journey for the last few years to sort of from default now to stabilization, but there's still lots of challenges out there. And I think what we're trying to do now in the future, in the coming year or so, is to be thinking about a growth plan. And so led by Dr. Ganesh Hitaraya. So he's leading a team of high-powered individuals in Sri Lanka, including also Dr. Indrit Kumaraswamy, to be thinking about and discussing a growth plan that comes out of a book of essays, but also of all the consultations that are ongoing, and also this discussion will also helpfully feed into it. And I think something that I'm taking away from today's discussion is that we, when the group is discussing the growth plans, is that we need to think about what to do. And of course, there's the reforms, there's the 5 blocks of areas that Ganesh has been talking about. I think the comment about production strategy is also really well taken. It's really important. And that we then need to think about how to do it. So we need to make sure that the institutions are there, and that's a long-term process, and sort of be providing realistic policy proposals that within the current context of Sri Lanka and going forward, and also when to do it. So the sequencing and of different policies are also very important. I think that's come up as well, because all these things together, the what to do, the how to do, and when to do it, is sort of the political economy of reform. And as I also said, the IMF program was probably necessary, but within that you get breathing space, and it gives you the options. It allows you to do things that you otherwise couldn't have done. And I think you need to use that space to actually then move forward and to actually transform your economy, and that's basically the task I think that we have for us. So that basically this book hopefully should then lead to a sort of a growth plan. I think that would then hopefully then also help government stakeholders to actually implement some of the plans. And so stay tuned, I would say, in the coming months and further ahead. So you will hear more from us. Thank you so much also for the speakers from me. But over to you, Hongbo, for the last final comments, and then.
Yeah. So thank you very much, everybody, for accompanying us until now, and the online people. I appreciate your time. So 3 magical points. One is we covered the causes. We covered how did they make it from the default to now temporary growth. I call temporary growth. And for people who need to know details, you really need to go back to that book. So it contains everything in detail. I only hope, my second point is that, when you had a problem, you recover from the problem. So what we see now is the recovery, is the stability, maybe. So my question is that really a growth? Is that really a sustainable growth? I think people are concerned about that. I hope it is, but until we see the structural reform, until we see more seriously, serious financial system, financial market reform and development, et cetera. But my wish is, let's hope this is continue the growth. So my third point, to be honest, when we talk about that problem, I very often heard something about China. We have not touched upon China today. China is not the leading lenders in developing countries. I'm not going to open this, but I just want people to think about it, because if I were given the chance, I would ask this question. So how China did in the Sri Lanka case, and now we are criticizing China for some other cases as well. So I just wish people can think more about this, and this is connected in any way. So people did not touch upon China. Anyway, that's my conclusion. I really, really enjoyed what we have covered. I'm like, we are running all the time, but we have done that. I think we have covered everything. We have followed the schedule, and thank you so much for the questions. For the time.